this video, I'll talk about how to find credible and reliable sources of information and get you to think about what makes information good. To do so, I thought it'd be interesting to look at a somewhat controversial topic as an example. So let's take the case of questioning whether smartphones are or aren't addictive. You might already have an opinion about this topic, so you need to be careful when searching for something and trying to look for reliable sources of information, that you're not being necessarily influenced by your own bias, by your own assumptions, but try to go with a kind of neutral perspective on the topic. Because if you are trying to look for arguments that support your position, you might just find, you're most likely going to find sources that do support your position, but that doesn't mean that that is the correct answer or the most reliable answer in the case of no right or wrong position. So one exercise to do, for example, would be to try to find actively sources of information that support and disconfirm a particular theory. So in this case, you might look for reliable sources that try to support this claim or not support it. So let's start from where you might go about looking for this information in the first instance. First place you might go is Google or any kind of search browser. And you'll probably type in some keywords or the question. In this case, I've typed in smartphone addiction, and you'll get a bunch of results, right? So just skimming through, like the very top results, we see here a help guide, then some suggestions of what I might look for, and then 2 articles, one from Forbes and one from BBC. Let's take the first example. So if I click on that link, it takes me to an article on Forbes by someone called Brian Scudamore, and it's got an article with different links. Might be reliable, who knows? I can see that there's a date, I can see when it was published. I've heard of Forbes before, so I'm thinking it might be reliable. It's some sort of news outlet. I've never heard of Brian Scudamore, don't know who he is. It says here entrepreneur. So let's dig a bit deeper into this. If I want to kind of find out who this person is, I might question what is their position on the topic, what makes them a good person to talk about smartphone addiction. So I'll leave the article here for now and search for who this person is. And a quick Google search brings up a Wikipedia page of this author, their LinkedIn profile, and their page on Forbes. And just by looking at these, I mean, you can also click through. You can see that he's an entrepreneur. He's founded a few brands. He's CEO of O2E Brands, parent company of 1-800 Got Junk, Wow, One Day Painting, and Shack Shine. And then this card here kind of expands a bit on the Wikipedia entry, and you can see that he's a regular contributor to Forbes, writing about small business ownership, franchising, and building corporate culture. This should perhaps ring a bell, because none of the comments, none of the information that you see here at a very shallow, superficial search suggests that he is in any way an expert on smartphone addiction. So the next thing to do is, okay, well, does it mean that he's not written a reliable piece of information where he's credited sources, he's looked for original and reliable sources of information? So I might still find something that's useful. So it's worth reading through the article. And you scroll through, and one of the things that you might notice is that there's a lot of first-person narrative. So he's talking about when he was in France earlier this year, his own experience. Later on, he talks about how he's spent some time in Kenya and had no connection with Wi-Fi and internet. But the whole article has links, hyperlinks to different sources. So you might think, well, he's checked where the information comes from, and indeed writes things like, it's been proven that smartphones interfere with productivity. The more critical problem is how they affect our mental health. So these are some really big claims, and these claims need to be backed up by evidence. So if we look at where these links take you to and see whether the links might take you to reliable sources of information, we see that the first link is a link to a press release by Kaspersky, which is an antivirus cybersecurity company. It's not a research institute. It's not citing academic sources. More importantly, this is an old article from, I think it was 2018. And if you click on that link now, it sends you to the current press release page by Kaspersky. So you wouldn't even be able to find the actual press release that he's linking to unless you kind of dig deeper and scroll through. So it requires even more research. The claim about how they affect mental health is an article by Forbes, so another article. It's not, again, research, academic research that's been cited, a study that's been read and looked at. Same down here, talks about lawmakers enforcing a ban on smartphones. Again, it's citing a Washington Post article, so more news, secondhand information that's been already processed by another journalist. And here he refers to the legal right to disconnect from work, which was a much debated law that happened in France. Again, citing another article, a news article from the Washington Post. And then brings on his own experience of working at his company, and the link is actually the Wall Street Journal blog. So that is, the Wall Street Journal is another news outlet, and there it's not even an article, it's a blog post by someone. So none of these sources necessarily count as reliable because they're not actually getting to the root of the claim. There's no kind of evidence or data that supports this. It's just news articles are based on people's opinions. They might be citing academic research, but we don't know without going through further research. So one would need to check what these Washington Post articles talk about, what these Forbes articles talk about. Maybe getting a quote from an expert or an academic expert would have been good. So this starts to question whether it is a reliable source of information. And don't forget that the original title of this article was The Truth About Smartphone Addiction and How to Beat It, which suggests that smartphone addiction is real and there's a truth that some people don't want you to know about, but there is a solution because you can beat it. And this article is supposedly telling you how to. So this is the first example. Now, let's go back at that search result page. And let's look at the second link, which is from BBC. So again, you might think, well, I've heard of the BBC, should be reliable information. We'll see. So the title here is Smartphone Addiction, Young People Panicky When Denied Mobiles. Now, the difference here you might already notice is that addiction is in quotation mark, and there's a kind of a clarification suggesting that maybe it's more about panic if I don't have access to my phone rather than an addiction. But again, panicky is in quotation marks. So the position here on the topic is perhaps more mild and less black and white, as the other article suggested. Like before, let's look at who the author is. What is their credibility? What makes them a good person to talk about this topic? And again, a very quick Google search brings up his own page on the BBC, his Twitter account, again, his LinkedIn. And we start to see things such as award-winning education correspondent for BBC News. Columnist down here for The Guardian. Now, we don't know what those award-winning, what those awards might be, and that might be something that you want to investigate further. But one of the things that is interesting is that it is about education. So it makes him slightly more well positioned to talk about young people, because young people are often talked about when it comes to education, for example. So there is some sort of relation to the topic, essentially. So let's look at the actual article and what it talks about. So if you scroll through and you read, you start to notice things such as the study from King's College London says such addictive behaviour means that people become panicky or upset if they're denied constant access. So here he's citing a specific research study that's been done from a university. It's a reputable university, but kind of any university that does research is going to provide kind of more evidence-based data than someone's opinion, obviously. And then you keep scrolling and reading through, and you get things such as a quote, "Smartphones are here to stay and there's a need to understand the prevalence of problematic smartphone use." This is one of the reporter's author, Nicola Kalk, from the Institute of Psychiatry at King's College London. So you start to think, okay, so they're talking about a study. They've interviewed one of the authors of the study. I have a name of the author, so I can probably look up what the study is, what the paper is, and I can see what that paper found, and I can see whether the journalist here has done a good job at summarizing that paper and drawing the right conclusions rather than just sensationalizing findings. And then you keep scrolling down in the article, and you see that Amy Orban is quoted or has commented, and she's a research fellow at the MRC Cognition and Brain Science Unit at the University of Cambridge. So there's another researcher or academic that's been referred to in the article. So you have here two names that you can decide, okay, I want to go and look further and see what are these positions, try to get more sources. So don't just stop at the first or second link that you necessarily find. So let's have a quick look at who, for example, Nicola Kalk is. And what is the study that is being referenced? Again, quick search on Google, just the name, and we already see that the first link links to King's College London website and her profile page, and kind of other related pages from her work. So if we click on that, it takes us to her profile page, and we can see up here she has a section on research outputs, so I can start to look at what are her publications, and is she a researcher that perhaps is working in this area and has been working for a while. So we look at the titles, and she's got things like synthetic cannabinoids use in psychiatric patients, prevalence of problematic smartphone use and associated mental health outcomes amongst children and young people, a systematic review. Others is about addressing substance misuse, bipolar disorder and addiction. So I'm assuming, given that the article in the BBC was from November 2019, and this article here on smartphone addiction usage came out in October 2019, this is most likely the paper that is being quoted or referenced in the BBC article. And not only that, but I can see from the titles in the other papers listed here that she is an expert on addiction, particularly drug addictions and mental health issues. So this gives her credibility in terms of speaking about the topic. So I could click on this link and then read the actual source and see whether the journalist has summarized the paper correctly, whether they've made their own assumptions, introduced their own bias. And more importantly, I've now found the original source, and I can quote or reference this original source as opposed to the BBC article. Now, you might also look for information on Google Scholar and do a very similar thing, type in some keywords into Google Scholar and see what comes out. Now, the papers that you find here are going to be different from what you found in the normal Google, but also if you notice, these papers are a lot older. So this is a screenshot I took in 2020, like about a year ago. But the top results are from papers from 2013, 2016, 2015, 2013. And that's because Google Scholar tends to rank things based on number of citations, how often they've been cited. It's a combination of different factors, actually. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the top result means the most reliable source. So with Google Scholar, you need to do a bit more research and digging deep. For example, that paper from Nicola Koch does not appear here, despite this screenshot being taken after that paper was published. So, but that doesn't mean that it's not reliable, right? So we start to look at the titles. This kind of part of the link tells us where it's been published. So you see this second article is published in Computers and Human Behavior, Journal of Behavioral something, +1. And you may or may not recognize some of these journal names. From my own personal experience, I know that +1 is a good, reliable source of information and journal, respectable journal. Computers and Human Behavior is another respectable journal. I'm not quite sure what Journal of Behavioral ... is, because obviously it's shortened and I can't see. I might recognize some of the authors' names. These are the authors. If they're underlined, it means they have a profile page and you can click through and look at them. And then on the side here, it tells you whether there's a link to the actual PDF. And here I can see that first one, there's a link to the +1 website. Computers and Human Behavior, that's a journal, but the link is to academia.edu, which is it's like a social media platform for academics. You can post your own papers to make them freely available. Again, we have another +1 link. This one, though, for example, I don't necessarily recognize. So I've highlighted here the links, and I don't recognize this academiai.com. So I'm like, okay, well, I want to dig deeper into this. Like, what is this source? Has Google Scholar scraped the right kind of paper, or is this something not as reliable, maybe? So I've clicked on it, and it takes me to this web page, and I'm like, okay, I'm not sure what Academia Chiado is, but I can see that it's an article published in the Journal of Behavioral Addictions. I can see the authors. I can see where the corresponding author is based. It's the Swiss Research Institute for Public Health and Addiction. So makes them somewhat relevant to the topic, and obviously they can speak about it. And I'm realizing, well, there's lots of repositories where academic papers can be published. There's a DOI link here. A DOI link is a link that's put for academic papers. It's a uniquely identifiable link for that paper in a particular journal. And so there's other elements here. I can trace back, okay, it's this journal in a particular issue, a particular volume, and with that DOI link. And I can also see another important aspect here is that I'm able to access this page because I'm logged in through Northumbria University. So I could have accessed this also through the Northumbria University Library, for example. And that makes me suggest that it is actually a reliable source, and Northumbria have paid a subscription to access this catalogue of papers. And then here I can see who the authors are, like I said. So if I click on full text down here, I can see what the paper is. And again, it looks like an actual paper, right? You've got the journal title here, you've got your title, your authors, the affiliation, an abstract, and the rest of the paper. So again, I've found a reliable source, and then I can start looking at what these papers are saying. One other note on Google Scholar is that given that these articles are perhaps a bit old, one of the things that you can do is on the left here is click on whether you want to see more recent articles since 2019, 2020. But you can also click on where it says here cited by 648 people, and that will bring up a list of all the papers that have cited this article, which are obviously going to be from 2013 or 14 onwards, so more recent. And you can see whether, by reading some of those 600 papers, whether they talk about this particular article in a positive or negative way. They might highlight the limitations of it. They might highlight the strengths of it. And this is it's a good way to kind of critique the sources that you're finding and seeing what other people are picking apart and highlighting from the sources that you are looking at. Equally, when you click on any of these articles, you will most likely see at the end of it a list of references, and you can look at what papers they've referenced and how they talk about the topic. So this is something that will be always very useful when writing a dissertation, a research paper, or just generally looking for more reliable information. So to summarize things up, there are lots of different places where you can find information. Some places offer a more some places feel safer in terms of finding reliable information. So if you have an option between searching between Google and Google Scholars, Google Scholar will most likely provide you with somewhat more reliable information, but that still needs to be vetted. At the same time, it doesn't mean that Google cannot provide you with reliable information. It's just a matter of maybe perhaps digging a bit deeper. The other thing to consider is I've searched for smartphone addiction. And the kind of keywords that you're looking at can have an influence on what you end up finding, because obviously this is all based on algorithms. So think about, are there any synonyms that you can use? Is it addiction? Is it dependency, overuse, problematic use, symptoms, solutions? What is it that you're trying to look at? This can also be used to help you find different positions around a topic, especially if it's a controversial topic. And again, instead of smartphone, you could just look at more generally technology, mobile or device. And this obviously is just an example, and you can use different combinations to then kind of repeat the process and dig deeper and see and build your kind of library of sources. Then when you do find a source, what you need to do is ask yourself, who is the author? What qualifies them to speak on the subject? Think about who's the website. Who is sponsoring the website? What are the biases that might be at play for that particular website? Where did the author get their information? Did they actually go and do the research? Are they citing someone else's work? Are they citing academic work? Are they citing other people's opinions? How can you verify this information from other sources? So don't just give for granted that the BBC article has quoted researchers from King's College London. Check what those researchers at King's College London have said. Check what their words were and see whether it matches. Also, have a look at when the website was published or the article was published. On the internet, it's very easy to change when a blog post, for example, or an article has been published and tweak the date. So keep an eye on the timeline of that. Keep an eye on whether it was updated recently, whether if there were any mistakes, these have been amended. And it says, and there might be other things that you're thinking about, but this kind of just helps you question and get you started in questioning the sources that you are looking for when looking for reliable information.